On 1918 Alaska Triangle, the most terrifying story of the lighthouse that spoke in tongues. On the morning of March 14, 1918, a Coast Guard relief vessel approached Cape Decision Lighthouse on the storm-battered edge of southeastern Alaska and found the lamp still burning. The logbook opened to a page covered in symbols no one aboard could read, and the three keepers gone without trace. But the station's Edison phonograph was running, playing a wax cylinder that had been recorded over with voices speaking in a language that linguists would later describe as pre-human or no language at all. Though 17 separate individuals swore they heard their own names whispered among the incomprehensible syllables. The cylinder, catalog designation CD191 anomaly, would be played exactly 4 times before the last listener, a missionary linguist named Theodore Vachon, suffered a complete psychological collapse and was institutionalized, after which the artifact was sealed in a copper cylinder and deposited in the archives of the Alaska Historical Society, where it remains behind 3 separate locks to this day, unplayed for 107 years. Wait, before we proceed to the archives, if this enigma has already captured your curiosity, tell us where in the world you're joining this investigation from. To make sure you never miss another hidden truth or forgotten theory, subscribe and join our search. History has not yet revealed all of its secrets. Now, back to the facts. Cape Decision Lighthouse stands on the southern tip of Kuyu Island, where the waters of Chatham Strait meet Sumner Strait in a confluence that has claimed more vessels than any maritime authority will officially acknowledge. The lighthouse was commissioned in 1915, built to guide vessels through one of the most treacherous passages in the Alaska Triangle, that vast region of unexplained disappearances bounded roughly by Juneau, Anchorage, and Barrow, where compasses spin without reason and the northern lights sometimes appear in colors that have no names. The station was designed to house 3 keepers on rotating shifts, with supply runs scheduled every 6 weeks during the navigable season, every 12 during the frozen months when pack ice chokes the channels and the sun barely crests the horizon. The lighthouse itself was an unremarkable structure by the architectural standards of the era, a 42-foot tower of reinforced concrete painted in alternating bands of white and red, topped with a third-order Fresnel lens imported from Paris before the war made such luxuries impossible. The keeper's quarters stood separate from the tower, a low building of timber and stone that hunched against the perpetual wind, with a covered walkway connecting it to the light. There was a fog signal house, a boathouse, a storage shed, an oil house for the lamp fuel, and a small shelter that served as both tool shed and emergency refuge. The entire compound occupied less than 2 acres of rock and scrub pine, surrounded on 3 sides by the North Pacific and on the 4th by dense spruce forest that climbed the steep slopes of the island's interior. The 3 keepers assigned to Cape Decision in the winter of 1917-18 were career lighthousemen, not the temporary wartime replacements that staffed so many remote stations after America's entry into the Great War. Henrik Vors, the principal keeper, was 46 years old, a Norwegian immigrant who had tended lights from the Aleutians to the Panhandle for 22 years. His assistant keepers were Samuel Rich, 33, a former whaling captain from New Bedford who had lost his ship to ice off Point Barrow and turned to lighthouse work as penance or retreat, and Thomas Good, 28, a half-Tlingit man whose mother's people had fished these waters for millennia before the first Russian trappers arrived. All 3 were literate, experienced, and by every account stable men suited to the profound isolation of lighthouse duty. Their last confirmed contact with the outside world came on February 28, 1918, when a passing mail steamer, the SS Empress of Canton, reported exchanging flag signals with Cape Decision. The lighthouse log, recovered later, confirms this encounter with a terse entry in Henrik Vors's distinctive hand. 28 Feb. Steamer sighted, 1400 hours. Exchanged signals, all well. Wind NNW, 15 knots. Barometer falling. Nothing in that entry, or in any entry preceding it, suggests anything unusual was occurring at the station. The logs show the mundane rhythm of lighthouse life. Weather observations recorded every 4 hours, lamp maintenance, oil consumption, fog signal operations, minor repairs to equipment, and occasional wildlife sightings. On February 15th, Thomas Good noted seeing lights over the forest, green and purple, too low for aurora. On February 22nd, Samuel Rich recorded unusual echo from fog signal, returns from wrong direction. These are the only entries in the month preceding the disappearance that hint at anything beyond routine. The relief vessel that discovered the abandonment was the USCG cutter Wayfarer, commanded by Lieutenant Marcus Sutherland, carrying supplies and mail for the spring rotation. Sutherland's official report, filed March 16, 1918, is a model of naval precision in its catalog of facts and notable for its complete absence of speculation or interpretation. The report notes that the Fresnel lens was rotating properly, that the lamp contained sufficient fuel for another 48 hours of operation, that the living quarters showed no signs of disturbance or struggle, that the beds were made, that the kitchen was clean with dishes washed and stacked, that 3 sets of foul weather gear hung on their designated hooks, and that the station's dory remained secured in the boathouse, oars stowed. The only documented irregularities were the state of the logbook and the condition of the phonograph. The logbook lay open on the desk in the keeper's quarters. The last standard entry, dated March 13th, was in Henrik Vorse's hand. 13 mar, clear sky, wind calm, barometer steady, lamp in good order. Below this, covering the remainder of the page and continuing onto the facing page, someone had drawn or written a series of symbols that resembled no known written language. Lieutenant Sutherland's report describes them as geometric in nature, consisting primarily of angular forms, spirals, and radiating lines arranged in patterns suggesting deliberate composition but no recognizable meaning. The symbols were rendered in the same standard graphite pencil used for all log entries. Handwriting analysis conducted later could not conclusively determine which of the 3 keepers had produced the marks, as the writing showed characteristics of all 3 men's hands, as if they had taken turns or worked simultaneously. The Edison phonograph sat on a side table in the common room, its reproducer arm resting on a wax cylinder that was rotating slowly, driven by a spring motor that should have run down hours earlier, but appeared, according to Sutherland's report, to operate with unusual persistence, requiring manual intervention to cease. The cylinder was labeled in ink, Vorse, personal recording, not property of USLHS. When Sutherland's men stopped the machine and examined the cylinder, they found that the original recording, whatever it had been partially scraped away and recorded over, a common practice for reusing expensive phonograph cylinders. What remained was something the lieutenant's report describes only as vocalizations of undetermined origin. The first person to play the cylinder aboard the Wayfarer was the ship's radio operator, a 19-year-old seaman named Edwin Grant. Grant listened to approximately 30 seconds of the recording before removing the cylinder and refusing to discuss what he had heard, except to say that he recognized his mother's voice calling me home, though she is 5,000 miles away in Baltimore and I have received no word of her illness or death. Grant would desert his post 6 weeks later in Ketchikan and was never located by military authorities. The cylinder was played a second time by Lieutenant Sutherland himself, who noted in his personal diary, discovered among his effects after his death in 1952, that the recording contained my father's voice reciting coordinates to a place I have never been, in waters that do not appear on any chart, coordinates I found myself compelled to write down, though I knew them to be gibberish. Sutherland included those coordinates in his diary: 58 degrees 4793 N, 134 degrees 2187 W. These coordinates are, of course, impossible. Minutes and seconds cannot exceed 59 in standard nautical notation. The cylinder was transported to Juneau and delivered to the district superintendent of lighthouses, who ordered it played for a panel of 3 maritime officials to determine if it contained any information relevant to the keeper's disappearance. All 3 officials reported hearing different content. One heard what he described as whale song, but with a rhythm suggesting speech. Another heard prayers in Russian, though I do not speak Russian and cannot explain how I knew this. The third heard nothing but static and accused his colleagues of perpetrating a hoax. This was the third playing. The fourth and final playing occurred at the request of the Bureau of Indian Affairs, which sought to determine if the recording might contain speech in an indigenous language that could shed light on Thomas Good's fate. Theodore Vashon, a Presbyterian missionary who had spent 11 years among the Tlingit people and had compiled an unpublished dictionary of their language, volunteered to analyze the cylinder. Vashon's credentials were impeccable. He held degrees in linguistics from Yale and had published papers on the structural similarities between Tlingit, Haida, and Tsimshian languages. He was 41 years old, in excellent health, married, father of 2 children, and by all accounts possessed of a stable temperament and rational disposition. Vashon listened to the entire cylinder, which ran for slightly more than 2 minutes. Witnesses reported that he remained motionless throughout the playback, showing no visible reaction. When the recording ended, he sat silent for several minutes, then began to write rapidly in a notebook he had brought with him. He filled 14 pages before stopping, setting down his pencil and saying, according to the official transcript, "It is neither Tlingit nor any related language. It is not, I believe, a human language at all, though human voices produce it. The sounds are formed by human vocal apparatus, but arranged according to principles that precede or transcend human linguistic development. I have written down what I heard. I should not have been able to hear it, but I did. God help me, I understood it." When asked what the recording said, Vashon replied, "It is a set of instructions, a method of navigation, not through space, but through something else. The keepers were being taught how to leave." When pressed for clarification, Vashon became agitated, insisted that the cylinder be destroyed immediately, and warned that whatever called them is still calling, and anyone who listens completely will hear their own name eventually, and then they will understand, and understanding is the same as answering. He was escorted from the room. Within 48 hours, he had stopped eating, stopped speaking except to repeat fragments of what he claimed to have heard on the cylinder, and was committed to the Morningside Sanitarium in Portland, Oregon, where he remained until his death by self-inflicted means in 1923. The notebook Vashon had filled during the playback was confiscated and sealed. According to secondary sources, no one with authority to access the original has confirmed these details publicly. The notebook contained what appeared to be transcribed phonetics of the recording, along with extensive annotations and diagrams. The phonetic transcription used a mixture of standard linguistic notation, mathematical symbols, and what one researcher described as geometric figures that might represent sounds human mouths cannot readily produce, or perhaps represent concepts that precede verbalization. Vashon's annotations allegedly included the phrase vocal map to the threshold and syntax of departure, and they were taught the words for leaving the world without dying. The wax cylinder was placed in a copper cylinder, itself placed in a lead-lined box and deposited in the secure archives of the Alaska Historical Society with instructions that it was not to be played again without written authorization from both the territorial governor and the superintendent of the Lighthouse Service. That authorization has never been granted. The cylinder remains sealed. Modern acoustical researchers have petitioned repeatedly for permission to analyze the recording using contemporary digital technology that would not require actual playback, arguing that spectrographic analysis might reveal information without the psychological hazards of auditory exposure. All such requests have been denied without explanation. The search for the 3 missing keepers was extensive and fruitless. The Coast Guard deployed vessels to patrol the surrounding waters and dispatched teams to search Kuyu Island's interior. Tlingit trackers from the nearest village, Cake, some 40 miles to the north, examined the ground around the lighthouse and the forest beyond. They found no footprints leading away from the station, no signs of a struggle, no indication that anyone had entered or left the compound after the last snowfall, which had occurred on March 11th. The dory in the boathouse had not been used recently. This was verified by the complete absence of water in its hull, which would have been present had it been launched into the frigid sea and then returned. All personal belongings remained in the keeper's quarters: clothing, books, personal letters, photographs, money. Henrik Vorse's pipe sat on the table, still half filled with tobacco. Samuel Rich's pocket watch hung on a nail beside his bunk, wound and running. Thomas Good's carving tools lay beside a partially completed sculpture of a raven. The search parties reported strange echoes in the forest, sounds that seemed to return from the wrong direction or with a delayed interval that suggested the landscape itself was larger on the inside than on the outside. One Coast Guardsman claimed he heard the fog signal from Cape Decision while standing 3 miles inland, though the signal had not been activated for days. A Tlingit tracker reported finding a circle of spruce trees, whose bark bore marks that resembled the symbols in the lighthouse log, though when a second team was sent to verify this finding, the trees could not be located. The official conclusion was death by misadventure, exact circumstances unknown, though this satisfied no one and was clearly an administrative formality designed to close an unclosable case. Newspapers in Seattle and San Francisco carried brief stories about the disappearance, but wartime censorship and editorial discretion kept the more disturbing details from public circulation. The phonograph cylinder was not mentioned in press accounts. The general public was told only that 3 lighthouse keepers had vanished from a remote station under mysterious circumstances, which was unusual but not unprecedented. The Alaska Triangle had already claimed dozens of unexplained disappearances by 1918, and 3 more missing men barely registered against the mounting casualty lists from the Western Front. Local Tlingit oral tradition, however, incorporated the incident immediately and with striking consistency across several communities that had no regular contact with one another. Within months of the disappearance, stories were being told of the lighthouse that learned to speak with the spirits, of keepers who were taught the old words, the ones from before men came, and of a doorway that opens when the lights appear too low and the fog signal echoes wrong. These stories were not shared readily with outsiders. Anthropologists working in the region in subsequent decades encountered resistance when attempting to collect narratives about Cape Decision, as if the event had become classified information within indigenous knowledge systems. One account, recorded in 1929 by ethnographer Matilda Stevenson from an elderly Tlingit woman identified only as Mary X, describes the lighthouse as having been built in the wrong place, where the boundary is thin, where the land and sea and sky meet. The place that has no name, where the spirits of the lost wait for those who know the old songs. Mary X claimed that her grandfather had warned against building anything permanent at Cape Decision, that the Russians knew to stay away from that point, and the Boston men should have listened, but white men never listen when money speaks louder than the land. When Stevenson asked specifically about the missing keepers, Mary X replied, "They were called, they answered, they went through. The door closed behind them. They are not dead, but they are not here either. They are in the place where voices come from, where songs are born, where the first words were spoken before the world was made." Whether this represents genuine traditional knowledge or is a narrative constructed post hoc to explain a puzzling event remains debatable. What is documentable is that the region around Cape Decision has a long history of unexplained phenomena predating the lighthouse by centuries. Russian fur traders operating from Novo-Arkhangelsk, present-day Sitka, between 1799 and 1867 filed multiple reports of unusual occurrences at Cape Decision. An 1823 report by the Russian-American Company describes lights that move through the forest without source and sounds emerging from the strait that resemble human voices but speak no words. An 1847 incident involved the disappearance of 6 Russian trappers who established a winter camp on the southern shore of Kuyu Island, approximately 2 miles from the future lighthouse site. The men vanished overnight, leaving their camp intact, their firearms undischarged, and their boats unused. A search party found tracks leading from the camp into the forest, but the tracks ended abruptly after less than 50 yards, as if those who made them had been lifted into the air or had stepped from this world into another, according to the report filed by the search commander. The native Tlingit population had their own relationship with the area. Cape Decision itself was not traditionally inhabited, serving instead as a navigational marker and, according to some accounts, a ceremonial site visited only under specific circumstances and with appropriate ritual preparation. The name Decision is an English translation of a Tlingit phrase that more precisely means the point where choice is made or the place of branching. Some translators render it as the threshold point. The decision in question was whether to continue along the outside passage, exposed to the open Pacific, or to turn inland through Chatham Strait toward more protected waters. But there are suggestions in the ethnographic record that the name carries deeper significance, that the choice being referenced is not merely navigational, but metaphysical, a decision between remaining in the known world or crossing into something else. The Fresnel lens from Cape Decision continued to operate until 1974, when the lighthouse was finally automated and the keeper's quarters were demolished. The lens itself was removed and placed in a maritime museum in Juneau, where it remains on display. The tower still stands, painted now in weathered white, its light solar-powered and monitored remotely. The island is uninhabited. Boaters occasionally anchor in the shelter of the cape, though many avoid it, citing persistent equipment malfunctions, compass deviations, radio interference, GPS anomalies that occur with unusual frequency in the immediate vicinity. In 1983, a team of paranormal researchers received permission to spend 3 nights at the lighthouse, intending to document any unexplained phenomena. They brought sophisticated recording equipment, electromagnetic field detectors, infrared cameras, and instruments designed to measure what they termed anomalous energy patterns. Their permit was revoked on the 2nd day after the Coast Guard received a distress call from the island. When a helicopter arrived, the researchers were found in a state of extreme agitation, demanding immediate evacuation. They refused to explain what had occurred, citing non-disclosure agreements they had signed with their sponsoring organization. The organization itself dissolved 6 months later without releasing any findings from the Cape Decision investigation. One member of that research team, a physicist named Dr. Ellen Kovich, published an oblique reference to the incident in a 1991 paper on quantum topology, mentioning a location in southeastern Alaska where conventional 3-dimensional geometry appears to fail under certain conditions, producing spatial configurations that permit topological connections to regions that may exist outside standard spacetime. The paper was poorly received and damaged her academic reputation. The symbolic writing found in the lighthouse log has been analyzed extensively, though always from photographs. The original logbook itself is held in a restricted section of the National Archives, accessible only to researchers with specific government clearance. Linguists, cryptographers, and semioticians have examined the symbols without reaching consensus. Some argue they represent a deliberate cipher or code, possibly created under psychological stress. Others see resemblances to various esoteric or occult symbol systems. Similarities have been noted to Enochian script, to certain variants of alchemical notation, to Nordic runes, and to geometric patterns found in indigenous rock art throughout the Pacific Northwest. The paper was poorly received and damaged her academic reputation. The most disturbing analysis came from a pattern recognition specialist at MIT who ran the symbols through a computer algorithm designed to detect underlying structure in seemingly random data. The algorithm identified what it classified as a recursive symmetry pattern with non-integer dimensional characteristics, suggesting the symbols were not random, but were organized according to principles that are mathematically consistent yet do not correspond to any known human writing system. One researcher, Dr. Lionel Cray, a now retired professor of symbolic anthropology, spent 15 years studying the Cape decision symbols and related phenomenon. In an unpublished manuscript that circulates in academic circles, Cray argues that the symbols represent not language in the conventional sense, but rather a notational system for describing states of being that human language is structurally incapable of expressing. He suggests that the symbols were not invented by the lighthouse keepers, but were somehow transmitted to them, that they copied or transcribed something they perceived, that they were, in effect, taking dictation from an unknown source. Cray notes similarities between the Cape decision symbols and markings found at other sites within the Alaska Triangle where disappearances or unusual phenomena have been reported. Symbols scratched into rock faces, carved into trees, drawn in journals or on maps. He proposes that these various symbol sets, though superficially different, share underlying structural principles, that they are dialects of the same pre-linguistic symbolic system, a system that precedes human language and may represent the notation, the primal symbols through which consciousness itself first learned to encode meaning. Cray's most controversial claim involves the wax cylinder. Though he never received permission to examine the actual artifact, he interviewed descendants of those who had heard it played and obtained access to Theodore Vachon's sealed notebook through means he declines to specify. Based on his analysis of Vachon's phonetic transcriptions and annotations, Cray argues that the cylinder contains a vocal algorithm, a spoken formula that acts upon the listener's consciousness to reorient their perceptual framework, essentially teaching the brain to perceive dimensions or modalities that are ordinarily filtered out by human neurology. He suggests that the keepers, through repeated exposure to something, perhaps naturally occurring sound phenomena in the region, perhaps something else, gradually learned or were taught this vocal algorithm, that they recorded it on the phonograph cylinder, and that the symbols in the logbook represent their attempts to transcribe into visual form what they were learning to produce vocally. If Cray's hypothesis has any validity, it would suggest that the keepers did not disappear in any conventional sense, but rather underwent a perceptual transformation that allowed them to step outside of or beyond the ordinary three-dimensional space we inhabit. They would not have died. They would have departed, moved into some adjacent reality that occupies the same location but is inaccessible to normal perception. The phonograph cylinder would thus be a kind of instructional recording, a lesson in how to perform the same perceptual shift, which would explain why those who heard it reported such disturbing experiences. They were, in a sense, being taught how to leave reality, though whether they had the ability or will to complete the lesson is another question. This brings us to the central mystery that has preoccupied researchers for more than a century. What happened to Henrik Vorsey, Samuel Rich, and Thomas Good on or around March 14, 1918? The conventional explanations are unsatisfying to the point of absurdity. They did not leave the island by boat. The dory was unused, and in any case, where would they have gone, leaving behind all their possessions and their means of signaling for help? They did not wander into the forest and become lost. Experienced men do not all simultaneously succumb to confusion, and the Tlingit trackers found no evidence of their passage. They did not fall into the sea. 3 men do not all simultaneously fall from different locations, and coastal searches found no bodies, no debris, no clothing. They were not attacked by humans or animals. There were no signs of struggle, no blood, no tracks suggesting predators or intruders. The anomalous elements, the strange symbols, the inexplicable phonograph recording, the accounts of listeners hearing personalized content point towards something beyond the conventional explanatory framework. If we take these elements seriously, rather than dismissing them as exaggeration or delusion, we are forced to consider possibilities that challenge fundamental assumptions about the nature of reality. Was there something at Cape Decision, some property of that location, that permitted access to other dimensions or states of being? Did the keepers, through their prolonged isolation and proximity to whatever phenomenon exists there, gradually develop the ability to perceive and interact with realities invisible to others? Were they contacted or communicated with by intelligences or forces that exist outside human comprehension? Did they, finally, make a choice, the choice implied by the Cape's name, to cross a threshold most humans never perceive? Alternative theories abound, most of them less exotic but no more convincing. Some have suggested mass suicide, but this fails to account for the absence of bodies and contradicts everything known about the keeper's mental states and family circumstances. Others propose murder by person or persons unknown, followed by elaborate staging to create a mystery. But this requires believing in a sophisticated conspiracy for which no motive has ever been established, and which would have required the conspirators to reach a remote, closely watched lighthouse undetected. A few have speculated that the keepers were removed by government agents in connection with some classified wartime operation, but no evidence has emerged in more than a century to support this, and it fails to explain the phonograph cylinder or the symbolic writing. The theory that comes closest to accounting for all documented evidence is also the most disturbing, that the keepers encountered something at Cape Decision, something that exists in that location, has always existed there, and will continue to exist, that communicated with them in ways that gradually altered their perception, and ultimately enabled them to physically transition into a state or space that is contiguous with our reality but dimensionally separate from it. This something might be a natural phenomenon, an as yet undiscovered aspect of physics related to magnetic anomalies or quantum effects that are intensified at certain locations. It might be something more radical, an intelligence or entity that exists in dimensions we cannot ordinarily perceive, but that can interact with our reality under specific conditions. The keepers, through their sensitivity, their isolation, their proximity to this phenomenon, became conduits or students, learned the technique or language of dimensional transition, and ultimately exercised it, leaving our world without dying, entering some adjacent reality where they continue to exist in a form and manner we cannot begin to imagine. In the years since 1918, Cape Decision has become something of a pilgrimage site for a certain type of seeker, people drawn to mysteries, to places where reality seems thin or permeable. They come in small numbers, usually alone or in pairs, often without announcing their intentions to authorities. Some are serious researchers attempting to document phenomena. Others are mystics or esotericists hoping for transformative experiences. A few are simply troubled individuals attracted to the dark glamour of an unsolved disappearance. The Coast Guard periodically discovers abandoned camps on the island, usually set up near the old lighthouse, sometimes containing journals or notebooks filled with automatic writing, symbolic diagrams, or attempts to recreate or decode the mysterious script from the 1918 logbook. One such journal, found in 1998, contained more than 200 pages of dense writing produced by someone identified only as J.R. The writing describes a 3-week solitary vigil at Cape Decision during which J.R. claimed to have heard voices emerging from the forest, to have seen lights moving beneath the surface of the strait, and to have experienced moments of clarity when the usual boundaries between inside and outside, between self and world, dissolved completely, revealing a deeper order in which space and time are optional and consciousness is the fundamental reality from which all material phenomena derive. The journal's final entry reads, "I understand now what they heard, what they learned. The phonograph wasn't a recording of something external, it was a recording of their own voices after they had learned to speak with a different part of themselves, the part that exists outside of time, the eternal aspect that is always present in the moment before creation, the moment before the word. I can hear it too now. It's not frightening anymore. It's beautiful. It's calling me to remember what I have always been. I'm going to answer. I'm going to step through. If anyone finds this, please don't be sad. I'm not dying. I'm waking up. JR was never identified. No missing person report corresponding to the journal's author was ever filed in the regions from which pilgrims typically come to Cape Decision. The journal remains in Coast Guard archives, classified as evidence in an incident for which no formal investigation was ever opened because no crime had demonstrably been committed. The question of the phonograph cylinder remains open. It sits in its copper cylinder, in its lead box, in a temperature-controlled vault in the Alaska Historical Society's secure facility in Anchorage. Modern directors of the Society receive periodic inquiries about it from researchers, journalists, and various interested parties. The standard response is that the cylinder is too fragile to be played and that there are no plans to authorize any form of analysis. This is technically untrue. Modern acoustic analysis could be performed without playback, and the cylinder's fragility, while real, could be addressed through standard conservation techniques. The real reason for the continued embargo is something that no one in an official capacity will state explicitly: a fear that whatever is on that cylinder exerts a genuine psychological effect on listeners, that Theodore Vashon's breakdown was not idiosyncratic but predictable, that the content of the recording, whatever it objectively is, acts upon human consciousness in ways we do not understand and cannot control. This fear may be well-founded. In 2003, a junior archivist at the Alaska Historical Society, working alone in the vault on an inventory project, violated protocol and opened the copper cylinder containing the phonograph record. He did not play it. The Society does not maintain functional Edison phonograph equipment, but he removed it from its protective container and held it up to a desk lamp, apparently attempting to see if any visual information about the recording's waveform could be discerned on the surface of the wax. According to his own report, filed after the incident and subsequently sealed, he experienced a sudden and overwhelming auditory hallucination, hearing voices speaking in perfect synchronization, every voice saying my name, but each in a different tone and from a different direction, creating a kind of acoustic hologram of my identity, as if my name was being called from every point in space simultaneously, from the past and the future, and from sideways directions that don't exist. And I understood that I was being summoned, invited, offered the chance to step out of the narrow channel of linear time and into the fullness of a reality that includes everything at once. The archivist replaced the cylinder in its container, sealed the vault, and requested immediate psychiatric evaluation. He was placed on administrative leave and received counseling for what was officially classified as an acute anxiety episode. He returned to work after 3 weeks, but requested and was granted a transfer to a different department, never working with the secure archives again. In a follow-up interview conducted as part of his return-to-work assessment, he stated that the experience had been the most profound moment of my life, more real than anything I'd experienced before or since. And while I'm grateful not to have completed whatever process was being initiated, I sometimes lie awake at night wondering what I would have discovered if I had simply said yes, if I had accepted the invitation, if I had allowed myself to step through. These accounts accumulate slowly, each adding another layer to the mystery without bringing resolution. The pattern that emerges is consistent. Cape Decision is a place where the ordinary mechanisms that maintain consensus reality operate less reliably than they do elsewhere. People who go there, especially those who go alone or who stay for extended periods, report experiences that suggest the boundary between subjective and objective reality becomes permeable, that thoughts and perceptions acquire unusual power, that dormant capacities for experiencing or interacting with the world in non-ordinary ways become activated. Whether this is due to some intrinsic property of the location, geological, electromagnetic, or otherwise, or whether it is a psychological phenomenon driven by expectation and isolation, remains unknowable from our current position. What we can say with certainty is that Henrik Voers, Samuel Rich, and Thomas Good, three experienced lighthouse keepers, vanished from Cape Decision under circumstances that have never been satisfactorily explained. That they left behind a cryptic phonographic recording and a page of symbolic writing. That the recording has had profound and disturbing effects on those few who have heard it, and that the location itself continues to be associated with anomalous experiences reported by visitors across more than a century. These are the facts, the stubborn residue that remains after all merely probable explanations have been exhausted. The lighthouse stands today on its rocky promontory, solar panels feeding power to an automated lamp that sweeps its beam across the dark waters with the same regular rhythm that the Fresnel lens maintained in 1918. The keeper's quarters are gone, demolished for safety reasons in the 1970s. The boathouse collapsed in a storm. The oil house still stands, empty now, its door hanging open. The forest presses close, spruce and hemlock and cedar rising up the steep slopes, their roots gripping the thin soil over ancient stone. The strait moves past in its eternal restlessness, tide and current and wind combining in patterns that navigation charts attempt to capture but never fully succeed in predicting. On certain nights, particularly in the transitional seasons when winter loosens its grip or when autumn darkness begins to reclaim the land from summer's brief authority, people sailing past Cape Decision report seeing lights in the forest, dim greenish-purple glows that move through the trees without apparent source, appearing and disappearing according to no pattern human observers have been able to discern. The Coast Guard receives these reports, logs them, and takes no action, having learned over decades that sending personnel to investigate the lights results in nothing but confused crews who return speaking of acoustic anomalies, temporal disorientation, and a pervasive sense that the forest is larger on the inside than its physical dimensions should permit. Occasionally, late at night in the archives of the Alaska Historical Society, the security cameras in the vault where the copper cylinder is stored capture brief moments of what technicians describe as visual static or digital artifacts, momentary disruptions in the video feed that last never more than a few frames. These disruptions always occur in the camera frame that includes the section of shelving where the cylinder is kept. When analysts examine the disrupted frames, they sometimes see what appears to be a figure or figures standing near the shelves, though resolution is insufficient to determine any details. These images could be artifacts of compression algorithms, or could be reflections, or could be a dozen other mundane things. But the security staff who monitor the feeds, especially those who work the midnight shift, report feeling uncomfortable watching those particular cameras. Report experiencing the sense that something is watching back, that the vault contains not merely inert historical artifacts, but something that remains active, something that waits and watches and occasionally exerts a subtle pressure on the boundary between itself and the people who unknowingly serve as its guardians. There is a theory, held mostly by those who occupy the fringes of academic respectability, that certain locations on Earth serve as thin places, spots where the membrane between dimensions or realities or states of being is more permeable than elsewhere, where what usually remains separate can, under the right conditions, overlap or interact. These thin places exist in the geography of human mythology and folklore across every culture. Sites of vision quests, oracle sanctuaries, fairy rings, doors to the underworld, axis mundi points where heaven and earth connect. They are usually associated with unusual topography, with boundaries between landscape types, with places of transition. Cape Decision fits this pattern perfectly. A rocky point thrust into the sea, marking the boundary between outer coast and inner passage, between open ocean and protected strait, between the forest and the water, between the known and the unknown. If such thin places exist, if Cape Decision is one of them, then what happened to the lighthouse keepers in 1918 might be understood as a kind of accidental threshold crossing, an unintentional passage from one mode of existence into another. They lived in prolonged proximity to the thin place, experienced its effects gradually, adapted to them, learned to perceive what is usually imperceptible, and finally, whether through choice or accident or inevitability, made the crossing from which there is no return. Not because return is impossible, but because those who cross no longer desire it, having discovered a mode of being that makes ordinary reality seem pale and limited by comparison. This understanding, if correct, would suggest that the phonograph cylinder contains not merely sound, but a kind of map or instruction set, a sonic key that, when properly understood, facilitates the same threshold crossing. It would explain why those who heard the cylinder experienced it differently. Each listener received the information their particular consciousness was capable of integrating, tailored to their individual perceptual framework. It would explain Theodore Vachon's breakdown. He understood the full implications of what he was hearing and was overwhelmed by the magnitude of the choice being offered to him. It would explain the continued restrictions on access to the cylinder. Those who maintain custody over it intuitively or explicitly recognize that it represents a kind of danger, not a physical threat, but something more subtle, a hazard to the integrity of consensus reality itself. What we are confronting in the mystery of Cape Decision is the possibility that reality is not singular, but multiple, that there exist dimensions or states of being adjacent to or interpenetrating our ordinary world, and that under certain conditions, in certain places, the boundaries between these realities can be crossed. This is, of course, precisely the kind of claim that materialist science rejects as unfalsifiable mysticism. Yet the evidence compels us toward it, unless we are willing to dismiss substantial documented testimony and physical evidence as collective delusion or hoax, which seems intellectually dishonest given the credibility and consistency of the sources. The three lighthouse keepers, whatever became of them, left behind a question that continues to resonate. Are there doorways out of the world we know? Thresholds that can be crossed by those who learn the technique, who acquire the perception, who say yes to the call? If such doorways exist, should they be sought or avoided? Is passing through them a kind of death, an escape, an evolution, or something else entirely for which we have no adequate terminology? These questions admit no easy answers. What remains is the stubborn fact of absence, the negative space where three men once stood, the silence that followed whatever words they spoke in their last moments in the keeper's quarters at Cape Decision. That silence has weight. It presses down on the historical record like a gravestone, marking the spot where certainty ends and mystery begins, where the known world gives way to something we can sense but not fully comprehend, something that calls out in voices that sound like our own names if we listen carefully enough, if we allow ourselves to hear what the wind and the forest and the dark water are saying. The lighthouse still stands. The light still turns. The cylinder remains sealed in its vault. And on the rocks of Cape Decision, where the strait meets the open ocean, the land remembers what happened, holds the secret in its stones and soil, waits with the patience of geological time for someone else to come, to listen, to learn the language that the keepers learned, to hear their names spoken in tongues that were old before human speech began, and to make the same choice: remain or cross over, Stay in the narrow world of familiar light, or step through the door into the darkness that might be, depending on your interpretation, oblivion or illumination. If such thin places exist, if Cape Decision is one of them, then what happened to the lighthouse keepers in 1918 might be understood as a kind of accidental threshold crossing, an unintentional passage from one mode of existence. They lived in prolonged proximity to the thin place, experienced its effects gradually, adapted to them, learned to perceive what is usually imperceptible, and finally, whether through choice or accident or inevitability, made the crossing from which there is no return, not because return is impossible, but because those who cross no longer desire it, having discovered a mode of being that makes ordinary reality seem pale and limited by comparison. This understanding, if correct, would suggest that the phonograph cylinder contains not merely sound, but a kind of map or instruction set, a sonic key that, when properly understood, facilitates the same threshold crossing. It would explain why those who heard the cylinder experienced it differently. Each listener received the information their particular consciousness was capable of integrating, tailored to their individual perceptual framework. It would explain Theodore Vachon's breakdown. He understood the full implications of what he was hearing and was overwhelmed by the magnitude of the choice being offered to him. It would explain the continued restrictions on access to the cylinder. Those who maintain custody over it intuitively or explicitly recognize that it represents a kind of danger, not a physical threat, but something more subtle, a hazard to the integrity of consensus reality itself. What we are confronting in the mystery of Cape Decision is the possibility that reality is not singular but multiple, that there exist dimensions or states of being adjacent to or interpenetrating our ordinary world, and that under certain conditions, in certain places, the boundaries between these realities can be crossed. This is, of course, precisely the kind of claim that materialist science rejects as unfalsifiable mysticism. Yet the evidence compels us toward it, unless we are willing to dismiss substantial documented testimony and physical evidence as collective delusion or hoax, which seems intellectually dishonest given the credibility and consistency of the sources. The three lighthouse keepers, whatever became of them, left behind a question that continues to resonate. Are there doorways out of the world we know, thresholds that can be crossed by those who learn the technique, who acquire the perception, who say yes to the call? If such doorways exist, should they be sought or avoided? Is passing through them a kind of death, an escape, an evolution, or something else entirely for which we have no adequate terminology? These questions admit no easy answers. What remains is the stubborn fact of absence, the negative space where three men once stood, the silence that followed whatever words they spoke in their last moments in the keeper's quarters at Cape Decision. That silence has weight. It presses down on the historical record like a gravestone, marking the spot where certainty ends and mystery begins, where the known world gives way to something we can sense but not fully comprehend, something that calls out in voices that sound like our own names, if we listen carefully enough, if we allow ourselves to hear what the wind and the forest and the dark water are saying. The lighthouse still stands. The light still turns. The cylinder remains sealed in its vault. And on the rocks of Cape Decision, where the strait meets the open ocean, the land remembers what happened, holds the secret in its stones and soil, waits with the patience of geological time for someone else to come, to listen, to learn the language that the keepers learned, to hear their names spoken in tongues that were old before human speech began, and to make the same choice: remain or cross over, stay in the narrow world of familiar light, or step through the door into the darkness that might be, depending on your interpretation, oblivion or illumination.